I created the page Mental Health CEO to help people give a voice to that suffering, to that condition. And part of what I find really joyful is to tap into the different sources of meaning in their life to create a new story, a new narrative, one where not only they discover purpose and meaning in their life again and direction, but also to discover the version of themselves that has meaning, that has purpose in life again.
Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education Podcast, the space where education meets resilience. I'm Dr. Joey Weisler, and in each episode, we dive deep into the personal stories of educators, students, leaders, and frontline advocates who are navigating the complexities within modern education. Whether you're just starting your teaching journey or are a seasoned professional looking for inspiration, we'll explore how to foster meaningful change, prevent burnout, and build trauma-informed communities within our schools. Now, let's take a seat at the front of the classroom as we get started. Today's guest is Ron Yap, known online as Mental Health CEO, a mental health advocate, counseling professional, and writer whose work focuses on helping people rediscover meaning when life feels empty or overwhelming. In his ebook, Finding Meaning in Life When It Feels Like There Is None, Ron explores how people lose meaning through identity disruption, survival mode, monotony, and living stories that were never truly theirs to begin with. For educators, this conversation feels especially relevant, where many teachers and school leaders are holding both their own emotional burdens and those of their students, often while operating what Ron describes as a constant fight or flight survival state, where meaning and purpose become difficult to access. Today, we explore what it means to reconnect to values, identity, and purpose, not just for individuals, but for those also working in schools and caring for young people every day. Ron, we're so honored to have you on the show. Welcome to the Classroom Narrative.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks again for being here. One of the things that, Ron, you talk about in your work is just this idea of existing with comorbid conditions, as we say. That could be OCD and anxiety. Comorbid is usually two different emotional disorders, if you will, combined into one. So for example, when we talk about OCD, in educators, that could be more than just let me spray the classroom handles or the desks with Lysol every afternoon before I leave, or lock my door 20 times to make sure nobody comes in during the day. It could also be a comorbid condition with anxiety in terms of that imposter syndrome that says, if this kid does not make a B on his exam, at least a B as in Bravo, right? I have failed him as his teacher because it means I do not do X, Y, and Z. That's also a form of obsessive compulsive thinking because it means if I don't do X, then irrationally Y is the result. So before we even get into the main conversation that we had planned for today, I wanted to see if you could share with us a little bit about what led you to this work and how you define anxiety, OCD, and the different needs of needing to gain counseling as well.
Totally. And I just want to chime in on the OCD conversation and what that kind of looks like in the education space. I think the example that you just mentioned is a great one. And that would be the obsessive compulsion part of it, in the sense that this idea that if I don't do X, then I'm a Y, I'm a failure. I'm not as good of a teacher as I once thought I was. And oftentimes that leads to the compulsion, which could be, for example, rehearsing your lesson plans like many, many times. And I think that was actually part of what I faced as well. Because when growing up, I had severe social anxiety to the point where I would sit below my apartment block and kind of rehearse the social conversations for the next day and even ruminate on the previous day's conversations for like 3 to 4 hours like per night. And that went on like almost every night. And that took up a lot of mental and energy, and I couldn't sleep because of it. And that led to this diagnosis of OCD that I had, which turns out that I was suffering for like close to like 10 years, just that I didn't have a diagnosis for it. So part of that process and part of that realization was what led me down this road to become a healing professional. And essentially, even though I knew that I had a condition for close to 10 years, I couldn't put a name to it. And when I did eventually seek help for the condition, that eventually led me to realize that there were probably many other people, countless other people, who were in similar situations as me, just that they did not think that their issue was worth seeking help for. And so I created the page Mental Health CEO to help people to give a voice to that suffering, to that condition. And eventually, along the way, I realized that this work was my passion. And that was what drove me down this path to becoming a mental professional. So I am a provisional clinical member of the Singapore Association of Counseling. So I'm from Singapore. And that was actually quite a recent thing. I graduated in 2024. So I've been a practicing therapist for close to a year by now. And it's been a really great journey so far. And part of what I do is, like what you said, to help people find meaning in their life. And what I've seen is that a wide variety of reasons that lead to the destruction of meaning in different people's lives. And part of what I find really joyful is to tap into the different sources of meaning in their life to create a new story, a new narrative, one where not only they discover purpose and meaning in their life again and direction, but also to discover the version of themselves that has meaning, that has purpose in life again. And this is a new concept that I've come up with called the concept of the inner hero. This is the version of us who has gone through life and they found meaning in life again despite all the challenges. And essentially, you can kind of turn them into your best self, into your best guide and mentor. So that is the concept that I've been working on for the past few months.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And thank you for all that you've been doing to help others through the mental health CEO page. And even back when it comes to OCD and education, I've learned that part of that also comes with the idea of just going through black and white thinking. So when it comes to using the inner hero to break that cycle, we'll definitely keep coming back to that during this conversation as well. But I wanted to also talk about the survival mode in education. And I'm actually now currently working on my first manuscript. Maybe by the time this podcast airs, I'll have a better sense as to how that is looking. But I can say in the first chapter of this manuscript that I have, what I've been thinking about in my opening chapter is what it was like when I was a heartless and soulless teacher in my opening years. And that's really the whole preface of the book, to talk about teaching with the heart and the soul. And what actually, with all irony, made me become a heartless and soulless teacher because of the fact that I lost myself in the process was after the Parkland shooting, when I morphed this concept of I want to help protect my students because I was picked on when I was younger. It really morphed into this idea that we have the non-negotiable deed to keep students alive, both physically and mentally, by all means possible and by all means necessary. The reason why that made me feel so heartless going forward is because it threw me right into survival mode. So, as somebody who writes about this idea of being in chronic survival mode, you think about how the brain prioritizes staying alive, right, over creativity, purpose, and even legacy. So, what does it look like to support meaning making in classrooms, or even just having a flexible, fun, creative curriculum in schools when kids and adults are both trying to just get through the day in a sense of survival mode? What does that look like for schools, education, and workplaces?
100%. And I think you hit on a really great point over there because in the ebook, I talked about chronic survival mode being one of the main reasons why meaning is lost. And the reason for that is both psychological and biological. From a neuroscience perspective, the parts, when you live in chronic survival mode, in chronic fight or flight mode, the brain literally prioritizes giving resources to the parts that are responsible for short-term survival and less so to the parts which are responsible for the things that you mentioned, creativity, purpose, and legacy, and specifically to the parts of the brain that are to do with visualization, goal setting, and future planning. And when that happens for a long time, those parts of your brain responsible for the future eventually get deprioritized and shifted over. And that's where we get this feeling of living in a fog, living directionless, because the point of our whole existence is more so to stay alive and survive rather than thrive. And what that means in the classroom when things like both physical safety and emotional safety are concerned, when you have that persistent cloud that's kind of looming over you of like, am I truly safe in a place where I'm supposed to learn? Eventually that meaning, eventually that story of what am I supposed to learn, eventually gets transitioned to how am I going to stay alive? Eventually for both educators and students as well, right? And we see this in every context, both from the macro level, it's to what's happening now in the world, to what's happening now in a personal level. Sometimes when the identities that we've held on to for a long time, such as our relationships or our jobs get lost, it leads to this chronic survival mode that eventually leads us to lose this sense of meaning. And I think what I always mention in cases like these is essentially to have a structured way of bringing back, of reactivating that parts of the brain responsible for visualization. In essence, to go beyond the current moment of danger and risk over to a longer term view of what your life is going to look like. The most direct way to describe this is to create a reason to live for, and not just a reason, can be very vague, but structured and vivid vision of what your life can be. And in essence, what this means is to, let's say, fast forward your life to when you are no longer simply getting through the day, to create a vision of that life that doesn't matter whether it's like years or even decades in the future, where you're not just getting through the day in order to give you a reason to get through the day for. I do like to give an example of what I mean by this. I used to have a friend who came from the education space, and she's now in a private education setting in Singapore. But at the same time, she had this thing where she's an English teacher, right? And she teaches literature and English. But at the same time, she was teaching for so long that she kind of lost purpose in that. And as a result, she kind of felt like her day-to-day life was very monotonous and she was living the same life over and over again. And essentially, the conversation kind of progressed to the point where I asked about, when was the last time that you felt that your life had meaning? And that was one question. The other question was, when was the last time that you didn't have to think about the passing of time, right? In essence, where you were so in the moment that you didn't feel like life was a chore and life was a drag, and you could feel like you were doing this kind of thing forever. And it made sense a lot. It made a lot of sense when she said that the last time she felt this was when she was writing herself. And her love for writing was essentially what got her to be an English teacher in the first place. And the other kind of interest that she had recently was in mental health. But at the same time, the idea of becoming a therapist was not something that was very appealing to her. But at the same time, when we kind of combine these two interests together, I brought up the fact that I knew some people who were in the field of bibliotherapy.
Oh.
I don't know if you heard of that before. It's essentially like art therapy, but
Mm-hmm.
using writing or using literature as a way to help clients gain meaning in their life. So it's kind of like recommending different books to your clients, and when they read it, they get a better sense of who they are. And the moment she had this realization that this was a profession that she could maybe see herself in, that was when her eyes lit up and she identified a way forward. It may not be the way forward, but a possible way forward. And that whole conversation became how there was a reason for her to be in her job, because the masters for that was not in Singapore, it's like overseas, and it cost a lot of money. So in doing her job, it gave her a reason to be more invested in it. So it wasn't just a way to make money. She wasn't just fulfilling the role of being like a teacher anymore. And it was for something. And so what that something is differs from people to people. But the fact that she could imagine herself in that situation, being a bibliotherapist or something of that similar nature, gave her that hope and gave her that inspiration to continue beyond her day to day. And so that's what I mean when I say creating a vision of your life beyond that day to day. In fact, beyond, maybe for the context of a student, it's beyond that next exam, right? Beyond that next test, that next presentation. What is it all kind of for? And if you can create a vision of that so vivid and so fleshed out that it acts as a guiding light, that's even better. And the same can be done for the teachers as well.
I think about also when it comes back to finding meaning and finding purpose beyond survival mode, I totally get that looking ahead to months, if not even years and decades away. What about those people that are looking for those quick fixes? Like they are just in such a rock bottom because they had that thing coming up in the next couple of days or weeks, and they can't even see beyond that. What about those people looking at that finite tunnel vision window? What do they do?
I think it's a really good question because the finite short-term moment exists because we feel that there's a current danger ahead. And the danger feels so pressing, it feels so urgent that it kind of clouds our mind. And that this is the only thing that matters. Even though perhaps as teachers, you're thinking to yourself, the next test is not the end of the world, but to the mind of the student, it feels like it is. And like I said, the first step is to kind of create that timeline where this is just the next step in the next part of your life. And something that I like to work on is not just the future version, but to the past. For
Mhm.
example, the question that I often ask people is that, let's say we have a conversation and we realize that one of their values is something like freedom or something like feeling in control of themselves. Then I'll ask, when was the last time that you felt this unbridled moment of freedom, right? And the answer could be, the last time that I was playing with my friends at the playground. For my example, like I used to watch this documentary called The Blue Planet when I was younger, and that led me to wanting to become a marine biologist in the past before I even became like a. And so obviously I can't overnight become a marine biologist, but basically the idea is to go along that route, right? To realize the same values of exploration, curiosity, and wonder in the natural world. And perhaps that could be replaced with going out in nature. That could be replaced with hobbies and activities that relate to that choice of that value. And I think that is what I would recommend to build out a list of those healthier coping mechanisms rather than the short term. The other thing that I would say is to make a habit of journaling. But apart from journaling, I think there's a specific way to journal. I think that a lot of people kind of like lose interest in that because they talk about their day, which is very important. But what about the future? What about the hope? What about the dream? And to, like I said, build out the vision of that, of what that life looks like. And that often is a healthier way of escapism that also creates a vision of hope and a vision of inspiration in people. In fact, an activity that I like to do sometimes with my clients is I ask them to not just write out a story of their own life, but specifically in a modern twist, I ask them to write out their own Wikipedia article, like for themselves. So, for example, the life of Joey Weisler or the life of Ron Yap. And that essentially is, I put it as writing fan fiction about yourself, but it leads to clues. It leads to clues about the kind of meaningful life that we want to lead, essentially.
Love that so much. Thank you so much for that. And I also think about using journaling as a way to rebrand the dream as well, because of course that changes over time. And I know that in my first year, when I was constantly rebranding my own vision of teaching, I definitely would journal for about sometimes an hour and a half every night, especially as I got closer to the end of the year, to be like, well, it didn't end this way, but it was more like this, less like that. And I wanted to see become more of this. And I used those same entries as eventually the touchstones to my own dissertation. So it really did become publishable work about half a decade.
Yeah.
And something else that I also keep just to the right of me over here in this drawer is called my Y folder, the Weisler's Y folder, where some days I'm just like, oh, that class is terrible. I want to quit. I don't quit because that's just a finite moment. But what I do is that I'll pull out this notebook to the right of me that I've been keeping for 8 years. And every single time I have a win, a student testimony, an email from a student or a parent, a review from a dean that went really well, anytime I have a win, it's almost like my win notebook. I'll just go through and I'll read my win notebook and say, oh, okay, well, today wasn't so hot, but there'll be other wins and they'll end up in that notebook. And what I've learned is that over time, I open up that notebook more often to put the wins in than to read about them feeling low.
100%. And I do keep a notes app of the times that I've been praised or complimented. And yeah, this is potentially after a win, but sometimes just as a remark that people say, I just kind of go back. And I think that helps with my social anxiety as well, because sometimes the thoughts are just, oh, you're so terrible and you're so, X, Y, and Z. But then this other person actually said this about you, which is really good. And I think that helps to give an element of objectivity to our own self judgments. And I think that is a really good practice for people. Yeah, like a win journal or like a praise journal. Yeah, whatever it is.
Definitely. And I think about the imposter syndrome as well, where I think it goes even beyond. And we say, oh, we quote unquote are not qualified for this. I think it goes beyond that in terms of it really distorts how we really are seen because it talks us down negatively to our own ego. Like, oh, not only are you not the right person for this, but you're also not good at it. I'll tell it to us, right? I'll say you weren't good at that. But meanwhile, we are beloved by our clients and our students. I am writing now in my book this week. I'm writing about everything I've done wrong in my first year of teaching. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I thought I did all these things wrong, but when I've spoken to just a few students from that time, they were very happy. So
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and just to chime in on that, because you mentioned that we do have that inner voice, right? Of like saying, you're X, Y, and Z, you're terrible, you're not even that great.
mm,
And Sometimes with my clients, I investigate that voice and we go into the details sometimes of like, what's the word choice of this voice? What's the volume of this voice? What's the diction of this voice? And the conclusion that we often get to is that this voice is not even us. It's someone else. It's another critical teacher. It could be our parents, or it could be somebody else that told us these things that we internalized. And that the opposing voice, the voice of encouragement and the voice of inspiration and hope, that voice is more similar to our own. And I think journaling helps with that separation process, by just being aware that you have a separate voice who is not you, essentially, telling you all these things. I think that's a good first step to being aware of that.
I'm already thinking about the voice that is my imposter syndrome now that you mentioned.
Yes.
Very different from my own that was always youthful to go into this profession as well. So when we talk about that, that also brings us into our conversation on identity. And I want to pause here to make a dark promise right here on my own show. And that promise is that even though it's not a guarantee, the chances are quite high that in every teacher's career, they're going to encounter some sort of experience from a student that will completely break their heart. Whether it's a student who dies through violence in a tragedy, a student who dies even from cancer, a student who dies from suicide, for example, a colleague that dies from one or the other, or even a student who, for example, might even get arrested or make bad decisions that, if only our classroom could have influenced them to have done differently. There's going to be some student or colleague in our career that completely breaks our heart. And we're going to need to be the ones to take ownership ourselves of liberating from any sense of guilt while working to understand that our career cannot be knocked from that moment and be defined through that tragedy. So then when it comes to focusing on this death of identity, as you coin it, when the story that we've lived is suddenly changed, teachers often experience this identity crisis through burnout, violence, or even major educational shifts through the system. So then how can
Mm.
educators rebuild identity and purpose when the teacher's story they once believed in no longer fits them?
Right. I think that question is universalizable, not just to teachers, but I'm just thinking of, let's say, my own field as well,
Yeah.
where I think even in the pre-interview, I mentioned that the percentage of mental health professionals who will encounter, let's say, a death in their clients, either through suicide or violence or substances, I don't know the exact number at hand, but it's very high. And as people in any kind of front-facing profession, that is a potential that we always have to be careful for. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about guilt, and it's also to do with grief. Part of the process is realizing, and obviously it's easier said than done, right? Of recognizing that it's not your fault. And the same way, like a patient with a terminal illness might still pass away, even despite receiving the best care possible. Along that line, the point that I essentially was thinking about as you were saying that as a teacher or as a clinician faces this scenario, the first response might be to face it with aggression, face it with anger towards ourselves and towards other people. Right? And this idea of why couldn't I have done better? Why couldn't I have did something different? Or could I have been a better clinician or a better teacher to be able to spot the signs? And I think this thought, this first reaction is important because, like we said, it embodies a certain value that you have. Even just the question of, could I have done better, signals that you wanted to be a more responsible clinician or more dutiful teacher, for example. And that in itself shows that at the core of your being is a good teacher or a good clinician who wants to do better, right? Maybe not a perfect one, but definitely a good one at heart. And I think that potential, that realization that the core of that being is pure and good is something that rides through the journey for no matter what you face, no matter what obstacles or challenges that you face, right? I think that's really the first step of that. And the second step, let's say even in my clients that are going through grief, they are going through guilt, I kind of get them to realize that yes, it is a point in your story. It may even be a major turning point, but it is not the end of the story, right? It could be the halfway point or the ordeal part of your journey or the climax, right? But the fact of the matter is that if you recognize that this is the climax of your story, it means that your story has not ended. And therefore, the response would be to accept that this teacher story or that story of you being like a counselor or like a great teacher, that version of that story has ended for now, but it is not the end of the story, right? And that there is a version 2 or a version 3 because we haven't even met the end yet. And so, what I like to say about identity is that it's something that evolves over time, right? And this may be the quote unquote death of your identity. But I think when people hear the word death, the temptation is to just like throw it away and say, I'm not using this identity forever. But the truth is, there's a reason why you were attracted to that story or identity in the first place. And essentially, even though we are letting it go, even though we know that this story no longer suits this version of us, that it can still be a part of you. And just as how I would say grief is not the moving on or letting go of someone or something, it's the acceptance of it and letting it in you so that it transforms into something else. And just like that, your story is something that transforms over time, right? And just being able to entertain that this is not the end of your story is a major turning point in that healing or grieving process. This is where I go back to the creating that version of you that comes after the pain, the version of you who has overcome that guilt or who has grieved sufficiently that they've become a new version of themselves. So essentially, this is your inner hero, but the idea of it is to create a picture of you that exists in that version, that amount of time later, be it years or decades or whatever it is, to know that this version of you exists.
I love this idea of the inner hero as well, in terms of knowing that our identity is not fixated, but also not defined. And it is always very fluid and constantly changing. And with that, it also leads us to think about living these stories that we don't always choose as well. So we've said before that one of the most powerful ideas that you've been doing in your own work, Ron, as well, is living a story chosen by others. And for example, that's people that are growing up to be in college doctors and lawyers who don't want to go into those professions. And as a first semester university professor, I see a lot of students drop off after their first term because they realize that going to college, even that, is not the narrative that they chose. It was their parents' narrative. And they're living a life that they don't see to be authentic and purposeful because they're making decisions that they didn't select. So then what's really scary about that is that even in seventh grade, we're sitting there and I don't want to say the word force, but we are really pushing students to commit to a major in a career path at 12 years old. Like I remember sitting there in seventh grade, like you have to pick a major that can help you take classes in high school and get into college and do this. It's like, great. So I have to plan the next 60 years of my life when I'm 12 years old. Fantastic. And I think we're really forcing that younger and younger. So, how can educators help students explore their values rather than simply trying to perform roles that are assigned to them and really keep authenticity and creativity intact as a way to help with their identity?
Totally. And I think that reminds me of my own country's education system, where I think we talked about it previously, where, like what you said, at the age of like 12 or like 13, kind of separated into different grades or bands, depending on your choice of subjects or even like your score, which determines what kind of stream you go to, whether it's a more academic stream or something where you're more suited for technical roles, for example. But like you said, the identity, especially at that point in time, developmental wise, is something that's so fluid and something that's so premature that if you're put in that situation where you're saying, oh, the next 6 years of my life rests on this one decision, it can feel like we said, the end of the world, right? If you choose wrongly at that period of time. And so to answer your question, like how can educators to help students to explore their own values? Really, the first thing that comes to mind is like what I said previously, to ask, when was the last time that you felt aligned to your own values? Right? Because the big challenge there is that, especially when you are 12 or 13, you don't really know what your values are. Whereas I think as adults and as educators, we can see that the student themselves are not just proficient in an area, but they care about something. They care about something that either they see is something that they want to improve or something that gets them worked up about something. To find out what they care about is something that we can find, just to bring up this term, in both pains of presence and pains of absence. And it's something that we'll talk about later on. But the idea of that, just to explain briefly, the pain of presence is something that we see visibly. For example, anger or sadness or jealousy, right? But the pain of absence is something that's indicated by that intense emotion. I'm angry at, for example, myself for not being able to complete the piece of homework. And that perhaps could signal that I value being responsible to myself, that I value having some control over myself. And essentially, if the educator can discern that and see that this is the value that they care about, they can allow students to have these moments of control. The big question is, when was the last time that you felt aligned to your own values, for example? And if you can see that being shown in the classroom, the more you replicate that moment in different and other moments, that can lead to a further process along the self-actualization route for that student.
I think about the pain of presence versus the pain of absence. It sounds like pain of presence that you're angry that something is actually there and existing in your life, while pain of absence is like almost like a regret to some kind. So, how can teachers use this framework of pain of presence and pain of absence when working to support students who have anxieties, disengagement, and even behavioral struggles in the classroom?
So we think about it as like two sides of the coin, right? And the coin that is the one that we can see, the front-facing coin, is like you mentioned, anxiety, it's boredom, it's disengagement, or it's behavioral struggles. And essentially, the other side of the coin is the pain of absence. And you're right in saying that it's a regret of some kind, but to me, it's like a yearning of sorts, like something that isn't there. It's just like how, for example, in cases of childhood emotional neglect, the kind of trauma was less about what happened and more about what didn't happen. And in that sense, the pain of absence is what we wished there was more of in that situation. For example, when I think about anxiety, the first thing that comes to mind is I need to feel more safe. I need more safety. For example, with social anxiety, it's I need to feel safe and secure about being myself and not being judged. Whereas disengagement or boredom could be a yearning for more variety in the classroom. And something like behavioral struggles, the first thing I think of is control. I want to have more control over my surroundings, over the way that I learn, and that's why I have behavioral struggles. And going back to the whole cycle thing, we often realize that feeling anxious in the moment leads us to less of that yearning. Feeling anxious leads us to feeling less safe and less secure. And it's the same thing for behavioral struggles, for example, where it often leads to a lesser feeling of control than what we had before. So to realize that this is a response to that lack or to that pain of presence, and that there is often a better way forward that involves both the teacher and the student, that is something that's a more productive and healthy discussion. For example, if the pain of presence is a lack of control, for example, the teacher may be able to say, here's the plan. Is this plan good for you? And it's eliciting this kind of like micro agreements in the classroom. I think that would be a productive and healthy discussion to have to give them more autonomy, over what their lesson is going to look like.
I agree. So it really comes down to offering students agency within the classroom.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I'll even say a little quick example here that I was teaching my college class about a week ago, and I'm very OCD in the classroom where I come in, I have my checklist, we have the syllabus, and it's planned out to the microsecond. We have agenda items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I have 2 hours and 30 minutes to get through all 7 points. And
Wow.
about an hour into class last week, and you were only on point number 2. And I'm like very calmly yet quietly about to have a meltdown because I'm like, I think
Mm,
I can of this for today. But the point that we were really lingering on was a collaborative activity where the students were really working to get to know each other. And I thought, let me just stop what I'm doing and just watch the fact that the students are having so much fun with this. They're making great memories. They're laughing. They're having fun. They're getting to know each other. And above all, my most important thing is building classroom community. So I thought, looking at my agenda, are items 4 and 5 really that important? Knowing that this
mm,
bring up point number 2 and getting to know their classmates to make everything else coming forward even easier for me. And so I let it go on for quite some time. And my biggest win of that day was letting the students build community. versus sticking to exactly what my agenda was supposed to be. So that was a win as well, just giving the students the autonomy. And I think that can also be a great framework through any means possible in letting students engage.
Yeah, yeah. I think like how I would phrase that is like there's a reason why you're stuck on the points 1 and 2 so much
Yes.
that you didn't go on to 4 and 5. And maybe there's a good reason for that. And it just seems like that moment was something they would remember as compared to if you just kind of like rushed through the original lesson plan. I think that's a moment of good teaching, if you ask me.
Oh, thank you. Because rushing also causes dysregulation as well. And so
Yeah.
I do have one final question for us. So, in shifting the lens from where we talked about students and classrooms, I really want to focus our final question on the educators themselves. And many teachers are supporting others while also quietly struggling to hold on to meaning in their own lives. And especially as we talk about teacher burnout, I just was speaking with Bev Johns, who is here in Chicago, Illinois, in the US as well. And she was a president and a policymaker for emotional behavioral disorders as well. And what she said to me in our conversation was that we're not so much facing burnout as we are facing devaluing and depletion. Because when you talk about burnout, it's almost like it's the teacher's own undoing. But what she really says is that there's a systemic undoing as well that's really causing all these factors that we're dealing with here in education. So, what I really wanted to think about is how educators, myself included, have entered this profession because of how they deeply care for young people in a way that sometimes their identity could become tied to the helping and protection of others. And when teachers are constantly caring for others, they tend to sometimes lose meaning in their own lives because they become emotionally unsustained from doing this type of practice. And so, in your work, when you talk about survival mode, identity disruption, and even value misalignment as a source of meaning loss, how can educators recognize this difference between caring for students in a healthy way and overextending themselves emotionally? And what can teachers do when they realize, like you mentioned, your own friend as well, who now focuses on bibliotherapy? What can teachers do when they realize that they've lost meaning in their work, yet they're still showing up for everyone else?
Totally. And I think when you mention that teacher burnout, essentially what happens is that educators, they put so much of themselves into being the educator that they neglect that they are a person as well.
Yes.
And what happens then is that essentially at some point you treat others or you treat the class better than how you would treat yourself. And that is what leads to the survival mode when you stop treating yourself like a person and more so as a role, as a job or as a title. I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, and that's the only part of who I am. That is what leads to the identity disruption and the meaning loss. Because the truth is, as people, we are far more than that, right? Even if being a teacher is probably like the main source of identity for a lot of us, it's not the only one, right? And I think the first step, like what I said, is to help teachers realize that they are people as well. And that step, that recognizing that you are a person, that you're a human being, means that you also have human rights.
Right.
And to assign yourself the same level of rights that you will assign to another human being. And that's why the whole conversation about being systemic, I think that's also a very relevant conversation as well. But I see this a lot in, for example, people who are chronic people pleasers or people who have been treated as like the person who does everything for everyone, that their role or identity has become this problem solver. I'm just this and this alone, right? But at the same time, what I tell this group of people is that first question is you want to give the best quality of care to your students, right? And the answer is always yes, right? If the answer is no, there's something concerning. But what I say is that when you go too far in this direction and you have this burnout or this meaning loss and you stop treating yourself like a person, is the quality of care and service that you give to your students, does it go higher or does it go lower? And the truth is, when you lose yourself, the quality of care and education goes lower as well, right? And in essence, this whole idea of like choosing between yourself and choosing between others is not a choice at all. And in fact, to be able to give the best care for others, you have to treat yourself like a human being as well. So in fact, it's the same thing essentially. It's two sides of the same coin. In a sense where you have to be able to treat yourself like a human being to the fullest extent, and that gives you the capability to care for others and to give the best teaching quality to your students as well. And so, in essence, the way to care for yourselves is also to care for the people that you are trying to teach or give a service to. And it's the same thing that I would say to a clinician or a counselor as well. And so I think that's the first part of it, which is that it's not one or the other. In the same way that for someone who is, let's say, suicidal, and I ask them, why are you still here? And they say, it's because of my dog, right? It's because of my pet or my kids. And then the way that I would rephrase that is to say that to give the best care to your kid or to your pet, you would also be the best version of yourself, the one who cares for yourself the most. And I think that is something that is kind of relevant to this discussion as well. And that being said, when you realize that you are a person as well and you have your own rights and your own limits, oftentimes you do have to make the hard choice to say that I have to pause this level of engagement and being open to my students to focus on myself first and to recharge my own battery. And I think this is often a hard decision for us to make because we know that people are relying on us, but the reality is that we're doing it so that we can return to that same level of care that we had before, right? And the other thing that I want to say about this is that all sources of meaning loss suggest that something has to change, whether it's in our own life or from a systemic level, something has to change. Oftentimes, we can't really think ourselves out of it. The reflection and the thinking has to lead to something, be it a minor change of how you interact in the classrooms or how you design lessons, to even bigger changes, like your choice of profession, the choice to leave or stay in the industry, or the choice to move somewhere else. Like something has to change. And the more we try and run away from this signal or this information, the more it's going to come back to haunt us in even bigger ways.
Thank you for that. And I think about one last thing as well, just one more question. So I think about also what's called the ASSIST model, if you're familiar with the Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, where for educators, they tell us that when we become certified in ASSIST, which I just learned recently, your certificate's only good for 3 years because methods are always changing, which means I have been uncertified now for 5 years, because I got trained in 2018. But I think about that model where they tell us that our job as frontline workers in schools, right, is to keep students safe for now, or safe, comma, for now, until the next trained person in the school, that could be someone like you, Ron, who is an actual therapist or a clinician, to really help them bring themselves into that sense of stability and safety. So we're like, as teachers, we could be the people who do CPR, but we're not the actual paramedics. So, understanding how that metaphor works, what are some ways that teachers can really maintain that boundary in the classroom of not acting as that therapist, but still being a caring
Right.
for students?
It's very interesting because this is a chance to shout out the
Yes.
book that I wrote. Yes, the hardcover book, which is Passive Suicidality. This is a book about passive suicide, which is suicidal ideation without the active risk of suicide. And the subtitle is What to Do When You or a Loved One Don't Want to Live But Cannot Die. And I think when you brought up this distinction between like being the paramedic versus being the first one to give like CPR, I think that itself kind of brings up the distinction between passive and active as well. And what I like to say is that even though, yes, the distinction is there for a reason, oftentimes what comes after when you bring them down from the high point of risk to a lower point, it often becomes passive suicide, right? But at that point in time, it is also a chance for anybody, not just teachers or loved ones or friends, to be the one to introduce the methods that we talked about previously, to give them a newer perspective of what the meaning of their life can be. But to answer your question, I'll talk about like my own experience first, right? Which is as a person with a mental health page, I do get quite a lot of messages from people in times of need. And especially since I talk about depression and suicide, I do get messages of that nature as well. And I think for me, it's a little bit different because I have like over 370,000 like followers on Instagram. And I think to accept that level of communication is something that I've recognized to myself that is unsustainable. And specifically, I say this because at one point in time, I put it in my bio, if you need a listening ear, come and talk to me. And turns out that was not a great decision because a lot of people came to me with their needs, and some of which were severe. And I was not prepared at that time to facilitate that level of conversation. I wasn't even a therapist yet. And yet I had this idea to do it in the first place. And even as a therapist right now, I know that as just one person, I'm unable to facilitate that communication with everyone. And I think that boundary or that mindset can be applied to teachers as well, in the sense that to know that apart from following procedures and being the one to, like you said, give the CPR, at the same time, to realize that if you universalize it and be that person to extend and become, let's say, the paramedic, and imagine doing that for the whole class, that's something that is completely unsustainable. And that leads to the burnout that you mentioned as well, right? And essentially to recognize the fact that we're the people that come after, right? And that in itself is something that is super duper important as well. Like we said, the ones to recognize when identities are being lost, when meaning's being lost, and to come in as that position rather than the paramedic. The other thing that was helpful for me at that time also is to realize that I need not be the only one kind of shouldering like the world. And the idea is to expand the support network beyond that to peers and colleagues if that's possible, so that you're not the only one kind of shouldering the whole world by yourself.
Definitely. It takes a whole village to make that happen. Definitely. And we're not
Totally.
only paramedic who's able to, or rather, we're not even the paramedics at all. We're not the only person who's trained to do CPR
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
So, Ron, what a great conversation this has been. Before we start to transition to our conclusion, let's take this time for you to share a bit more about where our listeners can find your work and tell us what you're working on now and how we can keep in touch with your endeavors.
Totally. I think the main platform for me would actually be on Instagram. Like we said, my main platform is Mental Health CEO on Instagram. That is a page where you can follow, and that's a page that's dedicated to raising mental health awareness and destigmatizing mental health conditions. And what I'm working on now is something that's really interesting. It's essentially an extension of the inner hero work that we were talking about previously, where how I would describe it is we talk a lot about the inner child work, which is the past version of you, but inner hero work is getting the help of the future version of you, the one who has kind of quote unquote all the answers, and to enlist them as the best possible guide or mentor or therapist that you can have, so that if you're facing identity loss or meaning loss or identity disruption, they have the answers because they've gone through that already. And I think that is something that's probably my main focus for 2026. And my big goal, my big dream is to turn it into a therapeutic framework or modality of sorts and to make it something that's usable and widespread all over the world. Yeah, so feel free to follow me on Instagram. Right now, I am running a free newsletter as well called the Inner Hero's Journey newsletter. And that's something that you can find on my Instagram page as well. Also, I probably have to shout out my book as well, the hardcover book, Passive Suicidality. That is on Amazon and it's available worldwide. So feel free to get this for yourself or for a loved one if you know that this is something that they can relate to. That talks a lot about finding meaning as well. And it's also for caregivers of loved ones with a passive suicide.
Thank you for that. And I really do also love the idea of being guided by your future self who knows the answers. What a great way to harness identity. And when it comes to identity, I want to quickly quote Jeremy Delamater, who is an educator as well, because Ron, what you said here is that identity itself is not something that we find and keep forever, but something that we consistently reconnect to through values, relationships, and the ways that we respond to suffering. And what Jeremy Delamater says is that our own identities are almost like this pentacon where identity is never attained, but it's always negotiated. Wonderful to all be together. Again, Ron, thank you for joining us. And for educators listening, one idea that stands out from Ron's work is that values function like a compass, not a destination, guiding small daily decisions even when life feels directionless. And in schools where teachers and students alike may be navigating grief, anxiety, identity shifts, or survival mode learning, that reminder matters to us deeply. So Ron, we're so grateful for your voice. We're honored to have you on the show. Thank you for your vulnerability, your insight, and using the work that you're doing to help people reconnect through meaning. And to our listeners, thanks for continuing to show up for yourselves and your students and for your communities. Thank you for joining us on the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast. If today's episode inspired you or made you think differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts and stay connected with us on the @Classroom Narratives podcast over Instagram and Facebook. Remember, together we can transform our scars into stars in education, one conversation